What's up, guys? Asian here again with the second part of our PTS patch notes discussion. First off, a couple of things here. I did note in the yesterday's video, some of you guys were kind of making comments about the audio. I am on my laptop right now. It is spring break, so I'm not at home, so I don't have my desktop mic. So please bear with me with the change in audio quality during this time. I am going back at the end of the week, get my microphone back and all the other sort of desktop things. So that should be fixed starting next week. But for this week, I am still on my laptop. The second thing is, for those of you guys who watched through yesterday's video, you know that that one is an objective viewpoint. This video is going to be my subjective views. These are my own personal opinions on what has changed on the PTS. So obviously your opinions may differ from my own. Obviously, opinions can differ, obviously. So just bear that in mind before you guys, start berating me or anything like that. This is just my opinion based on the changes that are currently as is. Obviously, things might change in the future, and my opinions will change as a result of those changes. So just bear that in mind here. This is not really a black and white video. This is more of a my own personal views on things. So first off, let's talk about what actually happened yesterday for those of you guys who are not as aware or haven't been really paying attention to what's been happening. So basically, DOS made a couple of changes on the PTS concerning light attacks and heavy attacks. So essentially what they did was they decreased the damage that light attacks deal. Light attacks also now restore resources. Heavy attacks, on the other hand, now deal more damage depending on the heavy attack. Some heavy attacks got buffed more than others, but they no longer restore resources at all. Now, the idea behind this is the idea of more or less closing what ZOS is calling the skill gap. Now, skill gaps are things that exist in MMOs. You have the difference between high-end players versus medium players, mid-level players, and what I like to call casual players or lower-end players. So when you have all these different levels of play, naturally there is all the skill gaps. So players who play at the very high levels obviously have very different levels of skills than players who play at the mid levels or low levels. And so what ZOS was trying to figure out here was how to close that skill gap, how to basically make that skill gap smaller. Right now, they believe the skill gap is too large. That is legitimately a big concern, and I do share their sentiment. I do think that the gap between a quote medium level player and a high level player is a little bit too large right now, and it is challenging to balance content with a very large skill gap. So think, for example, Sunspire, which you guys are seeing right now. Veteran Sunspire is fairly straightforward. I won't say it's easy, but it is within the realm of achievements. It's achievable for mid-level players. Now, if we take a look at Veteran Sunspire hard mode, that is obviously much more difficult. But because you're able to toggle it on and off, mid-level players can get a taste of hard mode, see what it's like, and if they feel like they can't accomplish it, they can drop back down to just normal vet. Another example of a situation where skill gap is not as well implemented would be the new dungeons. Ice Reach, for example, is a dungeon that a lot of endgame players, myself included, think are very easy. Both dungeons, in fact, are considered to be very easy for my dungeon achievement hunting group. But for the more casual players, the mid-level players, it's actually a good thing that they are on the easier side because now you're able to clear content more often. But if you were to balance these dungeons, for example, and make them too easy so more players can complete them, you risk alienating the endgame players. But on the flip side, if you make them too difficult, while you are pleasing the endgame community, less people are going to be able to clear it, and so less people will be able to enjoy that content. So I do see why ZOS wants to close that skill gap a little bit so it's easier to balance out content. However, I don't think that the way they're doing it is appropriate. But first off, my first issue here is their use of what they're calling actions per minute, or APM. In my opinion, it's a very pointless measure. It's a very messy measure. They're including things like movement in APMs. So Most high-end players will have higher APMs than most other players. That's just because we're weaving abilities. We're bash weaving, we're light attack weaving, so most of us will be getting somewhere around 120, 130 APMs or casts done per minute. Now, because they're also using movement, though, that sort of inflates the numbers a little bit here. So, what if I'm a mid-level player that has what I like to call DPS happy feet? I just move around a lot as a DPS. You can see here that I move around a lot right now. And it is, of course, content dependent. Like, Lacassius hard mode, yeah, I'm moving around a lot, and those all are being counted towards DOS's measurement of APMs. So is that an accurate measurement? I don't think so. If you truly want to measure DPS difference between high-level players and low-level players, or mid-level players and high-level players, why not just use DPS? Have ESO logs, so you should be able to get an idea of where average DPS is. ESO logs provides percentiles for bosses, yes, percentiles. Alternatively, you can just take a look at achievement clears. NOS has that internal data. They can just take a look at how many people are clearing that hard mode Sunspire, how many people are clearing veteran Wall of Lorcage, and so on, and basically get a sense of how many people are clearing this content, and there's plenty of streamers, plenty of people out there streaming either on YouTube, their builds and stuff, or on Twitch. So I don't think APM is an accurate way to measure out skill gap, but that is what ZOS is using. They're trying to basically lower the average APM because they believe higher APM means more DPS, which is not necessarily incorrect, but I think it's an inaccurate statement to say the least. Next, they're talking about raising the floor, which is always a good thing. I don't disagree. Or again, I just think they're doing it in the wrong way. More on that in a little bit here. Now, one of the things too with this skill gap is you don't necessarily want to remove that sense of being rewarded for doing hard work. People like me, other endgame players, we work pretty hard to achieve what we're able to achieve. I practice my rotations every week. We raid, this group Mayflower, we raid about 4 to 5 hours every week on a single piece of content in order to improve ourselves. It's natural to want to get rewarded for all that hard work. So while I do agree that they should be closing the skill gap, at the same time they also have to be wary of basically what I like to call handing out things. Basically hand holding essentially. Some level of hand holding is going to be appropriate because have newer players the game, new to MMOs in general, you are going to want to give them a definitely more of a more hand-holding tutorial kind of thing, but you also don't necessarily want to alienate your endgame players who have put into work and who actually have put out resources. This is at this point, I think it's a 5-year-old game. There are plenty of resources out there. Alcast, myself, Nephis, a lot of endgame players do openly and publicly put out builds, strategies, Twitch streams for people to kind of take advantage of. So it's not like casual players don't have any resources at all. They don't have any. They don't have many in-game resources, but out-of-game resources. There's plenty of that. ZOS has to be wary about potentially alienating. Have worked very hard to figure out the game mechanics, to figure out how their best builds, the best rotation. Moving to the next point that I have here, I do have a list of points just to make sure I don't ramble on too much. The changes that they proposed: decrease in damage and light attacks, and having light attacks restore resources, and removing resource return from heavy attacks. I think they actually hurt low-level and mid-level players more than they would hurt high-level players. A common thing that I have seen, an idea that I personally also believe in, is high-level players, players that understand how the game works, who understand game mechanics, who are willing to put in the time and effort to understand and adapt to the changes. They're going to have a much easier time altering their playstyle to fit these changes. It's just the nature of trying to stay on top of your DPS, trying to get those achievements, and score things like that. Meanwhile, low-level and mid-level players might not have the time to spend on mastering, a new rotation, or farming for a new gear, or just learning game mechanics, for example. Good example of how these changes are going to hurt low to mid-level players. Heavy attack builds, in general, their selling point is you can do good damage, not high level damage necessarily, but good damage and have basically infinite sustain. Since they're removing the sustain from heavy attacks, you don't really have that as a selling point anymore. You have to light attack in order to get your resources back. These same players that are doing heavy attack builds, they normally can't do light attack builds for one reason or another. Maybe it's a physical disability, like maybe they have carpal tunnel. Maybe they don't have the time. Maybe they're a third shift worker, and so as a result, they don't have the time to invest in learning a light attack rotation. Players now that rely on the sustain from a heavy attack build now no longer have that additional sustain. Now they have to light weave. Surprise, they are using heavy attack builds because they're not good at light weaving. So you're basically saying, hey, now you got to light weave. You got to do something that you're not good at in order to, basically sustain your rotation. That just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. If the idea is to buff heavy attack builds, why not just straight up buff heavy attacks and just leave light attacks alone? Doesn't make sense to also nerf light attacks and completely change how light attacks and heavy attack resource return even works if your idea is to help buff heavy attack builds. On top of that, I'm sure many of you guys have noticed this when you, let's say, do your random normal for the day. Those of you guys who still do random normals, a lot of casual players don't actually heavy attack that much. It's more light attack spam. We always joke about, oh, the snipe spammer in the back, or the light attack bow sniper standing 28 meters away from the boss. That's actually not entirely inaccurate from my experiences in dungeons. Most players typically will light attack spam. They won't really heavy attack spam. This kind of ties into my next point, which, Zoss is saying we're making these changes to make things more intuitive. Is it really making it more intuitive, though? Again, my experiences with players in Pug dungeons is that they prefer the light attack spam. And yet they're saying, we want to change how this works because it's not intuitive, that light attacks are for damage and all that stuff. And it's kind of like, it doesn't seem that way. Just based on what's been happening, what we're seeing, it seems like most players seem to understand light attacks are for damage, or at the very least, they don't really know how to deal with heavy attacks, or they might not even know heavy attacks exist. In fact, most people don't even know that medium attacks exist. That is a one Tamriel thing. So if you haven't been playing since one Tamriel, you probably don't even know that medium attacks were even a thing. So this whole idea behind intuitiveness doesn't really make much sense. And from my personal experience, playing from beta, taking a break, and then coming back during one Tamriel, I started off as a tank. All of you guys know me as a tank main. Now I'm main DPS just because that's what my needs, but I was a tank main for a very, very long time. When I first started getting back into the game, I light weave because I thought that was correct. I thought that was just how I wanted to do more damage as a tank. I was doing overland content. I wasn't really doing sort of endgame content, no group content really. So I just light weaved the whole time. That was, I am a gamer, so I've played a couple of MMOs in the past, but nothing quite like ESO. The main MMO I used to play was just RuneScape, so very different beast from ESO as an MMO, and yet I still light weave instead of heavy weaving. I didn't think about heavy attacks as a way of weaving when I turned to ESO and started to get in, doing more content. I just kept on, oh, I'm just going to light weave because, hey, that's what I should do, right? I should just be spamming left click. I should be spamming my standard attack because, that's how most other single player games that I played at the time work. Standard attacks and use your abilities in between standard attacks. So the light attack is what I would call the standard attack for ESO because it's just a simple mouse click. Heavy attacks, you gotta, hold down the mouse button. So I don't think their argument about intuitiveness makes much sense. Maybe you guys have different experiences. Maybe like heavy attacks make more intuitive sense to you than it did for, me 3 or 4 years ago when I was getting back into the game. But from an intuitive sense, I don't agree with their sentiment. I don't think that what they have is correct. And if they really want to try to get around this whole intuitiveness, get players to know that light attacks are for damage or whatever their paradigm becomes, why not just make a tutorial? A lot of MMOs, a lot of games have a tutorial. RuneScape, going back to the only other MMO I played seriously, they had a whole freaking zone for tutorial. It was Tutorial Island. I'm sure many of you still remember Tutorial Island from RuneScape, considering how many of us have probably played it. Why not just do something like that? You have, well, back in the day, you had the whaling prison. You have these tutorial zones already. Why not introduce things like what a light attack is, this is what a heavy attack is, this is when you want to use them, and so on and so forth. Yes, it might seem boring and dry, but it is necessary if think players are not understanding game mechanics. There's a lot of game mechanics in the help menu, but hey, who's going to read the manual? Nobody reads the manual anymore. 2020. So, if you want to combat this whole problem with intuitiveness, just make a tutorial. It's probably the easiest thing to do if you are that concerned with, players don't understand how the game works. Right now, a lot of how the game works, all this game mechanics comes from outside of the game. There's no really good in-game resource. A lot of people turn to Lcast or to me or to other discords, Nevis's Discord, for example, for information about game mechanics, how game mechanics work. Why not just include that in the game right off the bat? That way, have something there so players know, oh, I need light attacks or heavy attacks. I want to get resources back. It's just kind of like a, hello, why not do this? Finally, I do want to talk about how these changes impact the game identity and direction. They talked about ESO standing out from other MMOs by having fast-paced combat. They talk about ESO being different because they don't use ability cooldowns, they use resource bars instead, so you can't just spam abilities, you have to manage resources. Going back to the fast-paced combat, heavy attack builds feel slow, like really slow, like it's bad. Guys, I've been playing since Morrowind. When Morrowind patch came around, they also nerfed Sustain, which was a needed nerf. Sustain was through the roof during Homestead. You had infinite sustain PvP builds, which were a huge issue in Cyrodiil. You had infinite sustain in raids, which was making content trivial. So they nerfed sustain. A lot of people ended up quitting because of the changes to sustain, because heavy attack builds felt really slow. That was back when heavy attack Stamswork was a thing, back when heavy Axworks were a thing, because of the sustain changes. Now, eventually, obviously, people managed to, that's were introduced. Strategies were introduced to help out sustain. Food was introduced, which we didn't have Witch Mothers back in Morrowind. That was introduced after Morrowind. We didn't even have sustain food at all. So heavy attack builds were a thing for quite a while after Morrowind first released, and a lot of endgame raiders ended up quitting. I only know about this through the grapevine because I was not an endgame raider at the time, but a lot of people talk about the mass exodus after Morrowind, and a lot of endgame players played back in Homestead that no longer play because of the changes to sustain that were made during the Morrowind patch. Kind of seeing this sort of repeat here where they say, oh, we stand out because of fast-paced combat, but they're sort of gearing things towards heavy attack builds, which are inherently slower than light attack builds. The other thing, too, is that this was kind of going against their design statements that they've said in the past. Somerset was about a year and a half ago at this point, probably a little bit longer than that. In Somerset, they updated how heavy attack and light attack damage worked. They buffed light attacks pretty much across the board. And they said, and you can look this up yourself if you doubt me, they said that they wanted to emphasize that light attacks were for damage and heavy attacks were for resource return. This change completely flips that 180-degree change. Now light attacks are for resource return and heavy attacks are for damage. So which one is it? Want light attacks for damage? Do I want light attacks for resource return? What is going on? And I know that, games change. 1.5 years is a lifetime for an MMO. So maybe things have changed since then. I know there's a new combat team, so maybe a new combat team has new ideas. But to basically 180-degree on something that happened within fairly recent memory for a lot of players, that's a big change, and this change is pretty big for a lot of players. I mean, I've seen players talk about, I've learned how to play this game this way. Now you're basically asking me to play a completely different game, or what feels like a completely different game. That basically, what they're introducing is more or less a huge speed bump, sort of momentum. The game has been growing in population for years now, for months. And this change here, it feels like a speed bump in that sort of growing momentum that they have. If I feel like if they do go ahead with these changes, they're basically shooting themselves in the foot. But yeah, those are my personal thoughts on these changes. Basically, in summary, I don't agree with these changes. I think they're bad for the continuing health of the game. And I don't think that it is going to adequately address the skill gap. If anything, I think it's actually going to widen the skill gap even more because of the points I made with how these changes actually will hurt mid-level and low-level players more than they will hurt high-level players. From my experience and my testing, I'm losing about anywhere between 14 to 16k DPS, and that's fairly consistent across the board from other players who've also tested other classes. I mainly tested on MagDK. I've seen Maxwork parses. I've seen Stamplar parses. I've seen Stem Necromancer parses. Stem Necromancer and Stamplars, by the way, they're not losing as much because of the way the class works. But Maxworks, they seem to have lost around the same amount, about 13 to 14k. And MagDK, the biggest drop I saw was about 14, 16k or so. So if we're losing, and I'm not, a top end PVE player, I consider myself more of a kind of low high end player. If I'm losing 14 to 15k DPS, what is the mid level player going to lose? They don't have as high DPS to begin with, so from an absolute difference, they're probably going to see a smaller drop. But from a relative drop, they might see a bigger drop. And somebody like me, where I have the time and I can devote the effort to learning a new rotation, I'm going to be able to weather this storm. Sure, my DPS is going to go down, whatever. But I'm still going to be able to get, pretty good DPS for the patch. Mid-level player, a low-level player, they might not have the resources. They might not have the time. They may not have the physical capability of learning how to do these. So these changes, they're not so much as raising the floor as just blanket lowering the ceiling for everybody. And blanket nerfs don't just affect one group, they affect everybody in the game. So, in summary, these changes, I don't like them. I don't think they're good for the health of the game, not just as an endgame player, but as a casual player, as a mid level player, as somebody who's starting to get into PvE content. These changes are not. So, if you guys agree with me, you guys want to give feedback to ZOS, I highly recommend going onto the PTS, downloading the PTS, and using /feedback. They're prioritizing feedback from the PTS. Barring that, if you don't want to use another 60 gigabytes for another version of ESO, go onto the official forums, onto the PTS, and use the official feedback thread or discussion thread and make your thoughts heard. If we make a big enough stink about this, hey, maybe they'll change things. Maybe they'll say we won't do this, or maybe they'll actually take some of our suggestions into consideration. Code has made a fantastic post, which I'll link in the description below, which I highly agree with his analysis and his recommendations if they do want to make changes to how light attacks and heavy attacks work. If we were to listen to people like Code, I think the game would be in a much better place. But that pretty much concludes this, what essentially is a rant video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know down in the comment section below what you guys think of these changes here. And hopefully I'll see you guys in the next dungeon, but chances are I'm probably going to see you guys in Baldur's Gate when it comes out.